It's well known that we like to construct imaginary examples, which are often extraordinarily far-fetched. Honora O'Neill has a nice piece in which she said, and she'll say private, that she is sick of reading pieces where Peter, John, Paul. No, it's always done beautifully, politically correctly, alphabetized. So it's Abel talks to Brenda about Claire's relationship to Dennis, and it's unbelievably far-fetched. So we who write and think about abortion know the example of the violinist, but try explaining that to a public audience as to why that isn't the slightest bit relevant to the real issues women face in considering a termination. There's also an extraordinary premium attached to coming to amazing counterintuitive conclusions. The more far-fetched and apparently absurd your conclusions, the greater the chance of you getting published. And we can point to many well-known examples of articles with conclusions that are there to shock and then perhaps to persuade. So in his absence, I would have done this anyway, John Harris's Survival Lottery is one, but my good friend Hugh Follett's famous Licensing of Parents is another, where you just think, that's never going to run. And maybe the person who wrote it knew that, never had an intention of that becoming policy in the first place. Fourthly, a certain individualism. Philosophers work principally on their own as individuals. There are examples of collaborative work, some well-known one, but policy work in advisory bodies is essentially collective. And unanimity and collective agreement are often extremely important preconditions of efficacy in recommending desirable outcomes. So I think it's undoubtedly true that key advisory bodies have been able to command the agreement or interest of governments only to the extent that a bunch of otherwise egotistical and competitive academics have sat around a table and surprisingly agreed on a policy outcome. That really does persuade governments. But that means that there's a real imperative amongst people who otherwise like to do things on their own to sink their differences and to work with others to a collective and agreed outcome. That is difficult. And that relates under E to a certain tension that therefore there is between philosophical integrity and practical efficacy. And interestingly enough, I'm just starting to work on the issue of moral compromise. Not pragmatic compromise, but moral compromise. Actually retreating from a position you morally subscribe to in order to secure an all things considered best outcome. And there is a nice, but I think oversimplified article by Dan Brock, which outlines the fundamental tension in his view between the imperatives of philosophical honesty, the imperative to tell the truth, and the requirements of collective policy work, which he lumps under the rubric consequences. And Dan's view is the philosopher's first obligation is to the truth. He must speak his mind at all times, wherever it leads, and that forbids him ever to compromise or to say what he doesn't honestly believe. Well, the upshot of that is you won't change policy. Or in my view, you will very rarely change policy if that's the line you want to take. So I do think, and this is by way of concluding, that two themes have started to emerge in contemporary applied normative theory, which I think are extremely interesting and as yet the subject of little but burgeoning work. The first is an interest in what's called non-ideal theory, and that term comes from John Rawls's theory of justice, in which in the space of 2 pages, Rawls says, of course, my theory of justice presupposes ideal conditions, that is, perfect or near perfect compliance by individuals, more or less perfect minimal rationality and certain kind of circumstances. Then he says if it wasn't like that, I'd have to work out non-ideal theory, but that's for another day. And of course, Rawls famously never did the non-ideal theory, but there are a number of people now who are increasingly interested in non-ideal theory and what moral and political philosophers should say in circumstances where what surrounds them are not perfectly and ideally rational individuals and not ideal circumstances. So there's good work being done by people like Adam Swift at Oxford, Sue Mendes, Tony Cody, all starting to write. Glenn Newey is another, all writing on what the implications are for normative theory if you don't buy the very problematic assumption that it's absolutely ideal and everybody is a perfectly reasonable and rational agent. And the second emerging theme is, the phrase is borrowed from from Frances Cam, which, given the quality of her work, is a marvellously lucid summary and utterly unlike the body of her work. And it is applied ethics or philosophy. In other words, the first generation was, what do moral theorists have to say about a range of practical matters? Now the question is, let's say we have recommendations on legalizing drug use or allowing genetic enhancement or permitting assisted dying. How would we set about making that policy? What would we have to do, given what we know of the conditions of politics, to make that realistic law? And that, it seems to me, links to very interesting remarks made, again, just before lunch about the dirty world of politics. And I think there is an interesting area of contemporary applied philosophy, which is completely undeveloped, which is about good governance, or good governance in a non-ideal and dark world. So having woken up to the World Service in an interview with Nora O'Neill for the last couple of days, and Nora was very much at the centre of the House of Lords, filibustering, gerrymandering, whichever way you want to go. But she had remarkably interesting comments to make, as one might expect, about what the responsibilities are in a second chamber if you have a bicameral system. So I think philosophers have a duty to talk about good governance. I also don't buy the story that politics is entirely dirty. And for anyone who thinks it is, read Sue Mendes' recent book on politics and morality, where she makes some very nice, nuanced comments about that particular amoral, realistic view. So I do think that if, as serious, conscientious philosophers who want to change the world, and why would we be writing about these important issues if we didn't want to change the world? Suzanne Uniacke and I, Suzanne is the editor of the Journal of Applied Philosophy, we wanted to put into every single submission of an article, given you recommend P, how would you set about getting P? How would you actually make legislators accept your recommendation? And if you don't have a story to tell, what on earth are you publishing in a journal with that recommendation? We're not going to do it, by the way. We wouldn't get any submissions. But I do think that's the responsibility of applied, serious normative theorists. Start talking about how, in real terms, in a non-ideal world, you would act in the current context to bring about the recommendations you argue for.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, first question might be that if you claim that moral philosophers are no experts, and you are a moral philosopher yourself, why should I be so great about this?
That's a good argument.
Yeah.
You accept the argument, not my misstatement of a conclusion.
Let's see if there are any other questions, issues. At least one.
I was thinking, Dave, that there's a difference between some elements of your talk between what moral philosophers do in terms of the way they write or the way they espouse ideas when we're publishing, when we're lecturing. But as you said, that's quite different then from the role you might have to play in a committee. And when I look down your list of roles, we had agent provocateur, and there you might transpose John Harris, for example, where I've seen some quite...
You might say that, I can't possibly comment.
For example. But I've seen some quite good critiques in the media where they've actually said the reason we need people to say something outlandish in their conclusion, to make a statement, is so that we can rebut it and test it and have that debate. But I also wonder whether there's another role for the skilled moral philosopher that is less of educator, but one of mediator and facilitator, where you can apply that knowledge in the discussion and bring it in without necessarily kind of acting as teacher, but actually acting as the facilitator, the lens through which the decision can be made and arrived at.
I think just to defend the role of provocation, I think there is a role for someone to push the terms of collective deliberation to the limit, so that people are fully aware of what might be embraced and what the problems would be if there are any. So I want to do that. I do think there are serious problems about ending up with that if you seriously want to change policy, because, I mean, having been involved now for 5 years in the HFEA, I just know how you talk to civil servants and how you talk to the Department of Health. And if you want to make a difference, you certainly don't do that, whatever I might think. You do it very slowly and incrementally behind the scenes. That's going to make a difference. I think facilitating, the difficulty is that you go further and further away from what is the recognizable skills of a philosopher. And it doesn't seem to me at the end of the day that some of the things you're talking about couldn't be done by a highly thoughtful, intelligent, well-educated person, rather than a philosopher. If I believe that I have a distinctive discipline, I believe there's a distinctive expertise I'm in command of. The interesting question is how I deploy that expertise in contexts where it's in tension with what I actually think might be possible and ought to be done.
Okay, thank you. I believe Dave already mentioned the discussion during the break with CERN.
Shall I just explain what it was?
Maybe,
I mean, sorry,
It
sorry to summarize.
has nothing to do with that. My question is on the idea of compromise, because it seems to me that in a number of situations in these kinds of committees, you have a position, but you don't really have any stake. It's not something which is likely to affect you. So what you're compromising is your philosophical position. But the people who are going to be affected if your sort of the compromise is successful is a different group of people who have sort of a much more significant stake in the committee getting this right as a matter of practical policy than you might have. So I was just wondering whether you have any comments on that.
No, that's very helpful. The standard work on compromises is non-moral, and it's talking about advancing interests, or it's in terms of preference satisfaction. So the standard model is, just think of a straight two-party model, is I advance a particular claim, there's a competing claim. Both of us regard the worst possibility is no agreement. Right? So whatever outcome we want is dependent on cooperation. But we know we can't get our demand because the other will refuse, he knows or she knows similarly. So we compromise normally classically at a midpoint. That's unproblematic. Moral compromise is about my saying I believe P is the best outcome, everyone else thinks Q is the best possible outcome, where Q is at some distance from P. Now, if I think it's really important that as a member of a body we all advance the same position, I can see reasons why I should publicly say Q is the best. And that seems inconsistent on Brock's account with my continuing to believe that in fact P is the best. So many find the very idea of moral compromise deeply problematic. I do think it's not as simple as saying I don't have an interest, because I think if you're a moral philosopher and you're passionately concerned with particular issues, of course you want to see the law changed in certain ways. And of course you want to see certain kinds of policy adopted, because it's consistent with your judgment that that's the best, that it should be made into policy. The question is the conditions of having any policy at all that is a reform or improvement on the current might be that you compromise. Now, I think one view is that's a reason for moral philosophers not to be on policy-making bodies, because they have an obligation that goes back to Socrates to speak the truth and nothing but the truth as they see it. There is another view that they ought to compromise if, in fact, they want to see the best outcome. The least worst outcome. It's a defense of the ethics of defending the second best. And I think there's an interesting literature yet to be developed on moral second bests and why they might be defensible.
Final question?
Yeah, it's because I'm also the next speaker, but anyway. Here's what I'm a bit puzzled about is that there would be any concern at all about compromising. And the reason for this is this. I've sat on, just like you, on gazillions of these committees over the years. The first thing is the fact that you and not somebody else was appointed as a philosopher simply meant somebody made an ideological decision that you are better suited than somebody else because they like your views better and they were in power. That's practically the first reason why I don't think there's a big deal about that part. The compromise thing, though, I'm even more puzzled about that because those committees that I was in, they were never of the sort where, it had to be like a consensus opinion. At the end of the day, you would call a vote and you move on with your life, and you can be holy in your opinion and not compromise at all. And good luck to you. It doesn't matter. I mean, I don't think there's a big. This is why I'm not seeing really that there's practically such a big issue to be made about the compromising issue.
I think you have to distinguish different possibilities. One is in which it's perfectly possible to come to a vote, and it's consistent with a majority decision being the determinate outcome, that members of the minority can publicly state that they disagree. They write dissenting reports. Okay.